Trump appears to believe that the global tariff will allow cuts in the income tax. So the tariffs can maybe replace the income tax.
You just got to laugh, right?
It's pure fantasy.
Well, hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, Rui Teixeira, and I come at you every couple of weeks with the very finest and heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today, I'm pleased as punch to have my old pal, Michael Lind. Mike is a tablet columnist. He writes for numerous other outlets. He's a fellow at New America and actually a co-founder, I believe, of the organization. And he's the author most recently of Hell to Pay, How the Suppression of Wages is Destroying America. If you don't already have this, you should get it. But there's more. He's also the author of numerous other books, all of which I recommend, but in particular, The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite, still relevant today. Land of Promise, An Economic History of the U.S., United States. I think it's just a fantastic book or text on that issue. And that old classic, The Next American Nation, The New Nationalism, and the Fourth American Revolution. So if you don't have all of these books in your library, you're definitely doing something wrong. But we're not going to talk about all those books today. We couldn't possibly do it. There's too much stuff. But we do have a lot to talk about. So, Mike, let's start with tariffs. You just recently put out this great article on Tablet. Not all tariffs are created equal. The good, the bad, and the downright ugly. So tell us about that. What do you mean by the good, the bad, and the ugly? Explain that to the knowledge-thirsty masses out there.
Well, you have to put this into perspective to begin with. Most countries, whether they were city-states or kingdoms or empires or nation-states, historically have used tariffs and other measures to protect their industries and to make sure they're not excessively dependent on potential rivals or foreign sources of supply. So contrary to what they teach you in Econ 101 in the U.S., free trade is the rare exception in world history, and protection is the norm. And protection can take various forms. Tariffs, taxes on imports are one. Subsidies for targeted industries are another. Local content rules in procurement are a third. And so, if we're going to think rationally about economics, then these are simply tools, right? They're completely neutral. They can be used correctly or they can be abused. And in my article for Tablet, I argue that the Trump administration has done some good things, used tariffs correctly, but has abused tariffs in other ways. So to begin with what they've done correctly.
Yeah, the good. Okay.
That is decoupling partly from China, not completely from China, but partly from China. In the heyday of neoliberal globalization in the 90s and the 2000s and 2010s, the U.S. assumed China would always be this low-wage labor platform, sort of like Mexico, and that it would be content to be a geopolitical satellite of the United States, like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. Bad gamble. It is moved to become an increasingly autocratic state, and has also moved up the value chain to increasingly sophisticated advanced industries. And their goal is to dominate global markets in one strategic industry after another. And it sort of dawned on the U.S., but also on Europeans and Indians and South Americans, this is not just an American response, that if they don't take action, China, by dumping its subsidized overcapacity of manufacturing on world markets, will wipe out their industries, and then will enjoy a monopoly in advanced manufacturing, which is incompatible with national security, among other things. So beginning with Obama, we've had three presidents who've tried to deal with the China challenge in different ways. Obama's approach consisted of two trade treaties, the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TPP in Asia, and TTIP in Europe. And the idea was China will destroy the global free market trading system because it's not reforming. It's a mercantilist, state capitalist regime. So therefore, it has to be excluded. But for the Obama administration, we're not willing to give up globalization. We'll just draw a line. We'll draw a circle, and China will be outside of the circle. But everybody else will be inside of the circle, our European trading partners and our Asian trading partners. And it's an interesting theory. It failed for political reasons. The Europeans rejected it, as they have rejected every suggestion of a transatlantic free trade area, because they may complain about Trump's tariffs, but the Europeans have been protectionist since World War II, and particularly agriculture. Most industrial countries, paradoxically, protect their farmers, either for memories of famines in the past or boycotts.
Yeah, that's the common agricultural policy, I think.
And it no longer exists under that name, but
that was the original.
But every attempt by the U.S. to have transatlantic liberalization is met with angry demonstrations by European farmers. So TTIP went nowhere. TPP, the Obama administration made the mistake of appointing Michael Froman to conduct the trade negotiations, a kind of lobbyist lawyer. And as a result, the U.S. team was highly influenced to the extent of being proxies for the pharmaceutical companies in Wall Street, who wanted to rewrite the rules of Pacific trade to favor their industries, which was doing nothing for U.S. manufacturing. And consequently, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump denounced the TPP in 2016. So that was the first response to the rise of China. The second came with Trump. And I'll skip over that because I want to talk more about Trump 2.0. And not
absolutely, because I think that's on the mind of people out there.
Yeah, but he put tariffs on a lot of Chinese imports that were considered strategic. Joe Biden kept many of those tariffs and added new ones, a 100% tariff on electrical vehicles from China, which is the Europeans have slapped a similar tariff on Chinese electric automobiles to prevent them from dominating the European market. So this is not just America. So all of that makes perfect sense. Now, my argument in my piece for tablet is we don't need to decouple from China altogether. For example, Trump has several times in the past week has said, well, maybe American children, instead of having 30 dolls, should settle just for 2 dolls, being a major import from China.
Right, yeah.
So I think we can infer from that Trump's children had lots of dolls. I don't think most middle-class families have that many dolls for their kids.
We don't have good data on this, but I think that's a fair assumption.
But there are things that we can import from China, even if it's an industrial and military rival, that are not national security related.
Sure.
Unless we seek to cripple their economy and bring them down, as we did with the embargo of the Soviet Union. But it's not possible to bring down China the way the Soviet Union was brought down. So we need to work out some system of coexistence in which we can protect our strategic industries, but have relatively liberal trade in non-strategic industries. But turnabout is fair play. China should be allowed to have its own aerospace industry and its own silicon chip industry and so on. We can't expect them to become dependent on us forever. India, as it develops, will insist on having its own share of these industries. So I think we're basically just the logic of realpolitik and great power coexistence will lead to a world in which every great power, country or bloc, it may be a bloc like the European Union, simply protects its strategic industries, but then there's a fair amount of free trade in raw materials, commodities, food, if you can overcome agricultural resistance. So that's the good tariffs.
Right.
And even for them to work, they need to be coupled with all kinds of sector-specific policies. So, for example, if you want to move drone production to the United States, we're completely dependent on China for civilian drones, then that has to be done gradually. You can't just slap up a tariff and expect these drone factories to spring up like mushrooms the next day. It would be helpful if the federal government and state governments could coordinate skills training, right? Train Americans. They don't have these skills now. They need them. There may be need for low interest loans, for loan guarantees, that kind of thing. And so a pure tariff-based policy is likely to fail if it's not accompanied by all of these different industrial policies, which have to be tailored to particular industries. And then becomes very complicated. You want
Yeah,
something.
so basically that's not happening. I mean, it is kind of this magical sprinkling of tariffs on the global economic system and hoping it'll all turn out great for the United States. So why is that? I mean, is anyone in the Trump administration have a clue about this? Do they have an overarching theory, or is this just like totally ad hoc and produces a lot of the bad and ugly outcomes you talked about in your article, where they're just almost at random, seeming to come up with formulas and impose tariffs and use them in various different ways as a stick. As I
Well,
mean,
it is.
it's kind of crazy, right?
It's crazy because there's a really deep bench of academics and experts and people with trade experience for the last 30 years. They've been sidelined by mainstream economists, and by the Chamber of Commerce and so on during the globalization era. But there's all kinds of studies written of successful industrial policy. You have think tanks like American Compass and American Affairs Quarterly. If they just, I don't think they consulted anybody from American Affairs people for several years now. I've been writing all these very scholarly articles about what we should do
No.
in industrial policy. So I think there's a political reason. For whatever reason, the Trump administration is a coalition, like all presidential administrations, like all parties. And I think of it in terms of a Venn diagram of two intersecting circles.
Okay.
So one circle is the old right. These are the Reaganites. They want to repeal the New Deal, cut Social Security, cut taxes for the rich, shrink the size of the government, get rid of the Department of Education. They've been promising that since
Forever, yeah.
half a century ago. So the other circle is the so-called new right, or national conservatives or populists. They have a working class base, but they have their own intelligentsia, and they want protectionism to some degree, protection of labor through immigration restriction to raise wages, protection of strategic industries, if not all industries. And then the sort of chord where the two circles intersect is anti-wokeness. And this is something that the entire right can agree on. They hate DEI. There are only two sexes. We're not going to have open borders, the whole thing. It's essentially a reaction to the aggressive wokeness of the left. So I think if you look at this administration, and it's still early, the first few months, in effect, Trump has given the new right what it wanted in terms of protecting manufacturing and labor markets. But at the same time, it has given the old right what it wants in terms of unleashing the libertarian Elon Musk and DOGE, trying just to randomly fire people from the federal government and randomly, shut down independent agencies created by Congress, which is probably unconstitutional, and to extend the tax cuts from a decade ago. And I don't think it works. I don't think it works because certainly the tariff policy cannot work if
Sure.
it's accompanied with just random mindless deregulation. If anything, you need more federal spending on some programs. That's not to say, the education department, it contributes less than 10% of funding to most schools, and it's been used for social engineering purposes. If it vanishes, I don't think that would be a great loss. But that has to be done by Congress anyway, by statute. And the president's not a dictator; can't just abolish.
Right. So is
Agent.
part of the problem here, Mike, that this kind of gets at your intersecting sets. We've got our new right, which is certainly one thing a lot of people believe in the new right is some sort of tariff protectionist regime. But the more sophisticated parts of the new right have much more broader ideas about how you can achieve American economic revival. The kinds of things you've been talking about, people in American affairs, lots of other people have sophisticated ideas about this, but basically they've taken this one strand from the new right and grafted it on to what is still a fairly libertarian orientation of a good chunk of the Republican Party and some of its big contributors. So it's kind of like this Frankenstein monster of economic policy where the parts don't fit together.
Yeah, it's like a science fiction movie where you put a human head on a dog's body and a dog's head on a body and so on. And it just doesn't work. And the same is true of the immigration policy. And I've always thought that Trump in his first term, as well as this term, there's a high degree of cynicism here. Even in the way that Trump talks about immigration, because there's a problem with these transnational criminal gangs, and by all means, they should be arrested and deported. But the main threat to the working class of mass immigration comes from hardworking, otherwise law-abiding immigrants.
Yes, exactly.
Because it drives down their wages by expanding the labor pool. And so when you're demonizing the immigrants as rapists and murderers and so on, you're not talking about wage suppression. So why aren't you talking about wage suppression? Because one of the bases of the Republican Party is agribusiness and small businesses that employ illegal immigrants. Right. And so if you say, well, we're just going to focus on the criminals, well, then you allow them to keep paying people off the books. Now, Ron DeSantis, who was the potential alternative, as the post-Trumpist, has actually been more honest and has done a better job in Florida by concentrating on requiring not all businesses, but a lot of businesses to use E-Verify, right? So it's a demand-side approach to preventing the hiring of illegal immigrants. And if that were done nationwide, then the supply would dry up even without militarizing the border. We know this because during the Great Recession, immigration collapsed. Well, why did it collapse? It collapsed because everybody in the world now has a cell phone. And all these people from Mexico and Central America and Africa and the Middle East were phoning their friends and acquaintances in the U.S. who told them nobody's hiring, right?
Right.
This is what nobody understands about immigration is basically labor trafficking across national borders. And the whole thing is arranged by the employers at one end and the gangsters at the other end. And then in between the coyotes in the Mexican cartels who smuggled people to the border and the sweatshop in the United States or the building contractor using illegal immigrant workers as roofers on a new subdivision, there was this whole ecosystem that's been exposed of nonprofits, many of them funded by the federal government.
Yeah.
So there was this whole pipeline, right? And the way this is portrayed by the liberal media is that people are suffering terribly from war and poverty, and then they wander through the desert like the Hebrews, leaving Egypt, and then they have no idea where they're going. That's not how it works anywhere.
And they just happen to wind up in the United States. Yeah. What a
That's not
coincidence. Yes.
how the way it works is the contractor, who may be a Republican in Texas or California, tells the illegal immigrant worker, we're going to have a big new subdivision job in the fall. So tell your cousins, they bricklayers, come on up, right? So the bricklayer gets a phone call, knows exactly where to go, stays with his cousin in Texas or California, is shown how to get a stolen social security number or an ITIN number, is helped by NGOs, right? So this is all run by the employers. And if you have Trump and the Republican so-called populists never mentioning that this is a labor trafficking scheme for employers, right? That this is just about crime, that's just deeply dishonest.
So relative to the actual problem, it's sort of full of sound and fury, signifying nothing other than, signaling, I guess, to his base. He's on the case and he's going to take care of those immigrants, a lot of whom are criminals, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, looking across, this trade and immigration economic policy set, do you see any hope that they'll kind of right the ship here? Or are we basically, have they already, in a sense, blown it? I mean, blown it could be blown it, just regular blown it, like they just run out of their political capital. Or certainly there are a lot of people on the left who argue that based on what's already been done, they're going to cause a global cataclysmic depression and, sort of we're all going to go back to the Stone Age. So where are we relative to those two potential outcomes?
I spoke about the good, which is the decoupling from China. The bad and the ugly, the bad are these so-called reciprocal tariffs, which are not actually the equivalent of tariffs imposed on U.S. exports. They're just this weird number that was come up with based on the trade deficit.
Yeah, it's pretty weird formula.
And since poor countries tend to have bigger surpluses, trade surpluses with the U.S. than rich countries, with the exception of China and Germany, that's because they're poor. They can sell us a lot of diamonds or raw materials, or in the case of African countries, animal hides. But the poor Africans are not importing lots of goods from the United States, right? And so Lesotho was punished with like the highest tariffs.
Yeah, don't make no sense.
Because of the surplus. So that was just pure idiocy. Now, I think that is dead for now. That is when the stock market crashed more violently than it had since COVID, Trump paused those reciprocal tariffs. And I think they will come up with some face-saving excuse. And they're saying, well, it was just a bargaining chip. And now we'll do 190 deals with 190 countries. So I don't think those are coming back.
That's the party line, yeah.
The third aspect, which I call the ugly, is the global tariff, which I don't quite understand. This is a 10% tariff on all imports. And the reason I don't understand it is if it's a bargaining chip, right, then why assign a number to it like 10%? If you really want to bargain, make it 50% until they open their markets and then get rid of it, right? Bargaining chip.
Until they holler uncle.
Yeah, they should be dramatic and temporary. So it's too small to be a dramatic opening gambit in a temporary negotiation. Trump appears to believe that the global tariff will allow cuts in the income tax. He has said that
it's going to be a revenue source, right?
Yeah, it's a revenue tariff. So the tariffs can maybe replace the income tax.
You just got to laugh, right?
And then Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, who's already got a reputation as being the most obsequious person in the Trump administration.
That's something.
Tried to do some damage control by saying, well, maybe we'll just get rid of income taxes for people under, I think it was $100,000 or $150,000. It's pure fantasy. If a tariff, revenue tariffs have to be low to raise revenue, because if they're high, they become protective tariffs. Nobody imports the good, and they switch to domestic production, which is the whole point of a protective tariff. If they're low enough that imports don't stop, then you can get a little revenue from them, but it's going to be de minimis. It's going to be negligible revenue. Now, revenue tariffs were used in the U.S. and in Latin America and some other countries in the 19th century because these were poor agrarian developing countries, and the state capacity of the governments in the U.S. and Latin America was so primitive that the only way you could tax the rich was to tax their luxury goods
Yeah.
being unloaded from the ships, because otherwise they would hide their wealth and or they would beat up the tax collectors in rural areas, right? Once you have a modern bureaucratic state and an internal revenue agency, which of course the old right is trying to dismantle or render ineffective, but then you can have income taxes, you can have personal and corporate income taxes, you can have payroll taxes, you can have state and local consumption taxes. We don't have a national consumption tax, but most countries have a VAT, value added tax. So, but it is really shocking that the President of the United States was allowed to go out and say we can raise so much revenue from the tariffs that we can eliminate the income tax.
Yeah, yeah. It's all thoroughly
Where
bonkers.
where are the handlers?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's part of the secret sauce of Trumpism is Trump was the only one who probably could have really realigned the Republican Party toward the working class as fast as he did. The problem is now once they've caught the bus, nobody has any idea what to do with it, particularly Trump. I mean, because that's not how he rolls, right? I mean, he can create the entity, but he can't really do anything with it once it's been created. So as a result, we have all these wires hanging from the ceilings, contradictory policies, things that don't make any sense, and this kind of weird cult of the personality around Trump. Based on that, how would you see the factional conflict working out in the Republican Party sort of going forward, both during the administration and potentially after it?
Well, within the administration, I'm mildly encouraged because you've seen Trump siding with his cabinet secretaries against Elon Musk in terms of the cuts, and Musk is departing, and there seems to be, you know, some tension between Musk and Trump, which people predicted, and that's encouraging. Scott Bessent, is that how it's pronounced, by the way? Is it Bessent?
I think so.
Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is doing as the best that you can, both as a Trump splainer and a Trump handler, right? Like reassuring the markets and business elites and so on, but also coming up with a somewhat plausible description of a strategy where you combine import substitution through tariffs with deregulation to encourage factory construction and also cheap energy prices. Now, Bessent, interestingly, never mentions other industrial policies, but still, that's, there's somebody in the administration with a strategy there, however incomplete. Trump finally last week said he's not interested in running for a third term. And I think he'd just been teasing that so he wouldn't be a lame duck.
That's just trolling people.
Yeah, he's trolling people. And as possible successors, he mentioned J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, who are sensible. And they're also associated with what I'm calling the new right, the more pro-labor communitarian.
Yes.
So I think that's moderately encouraging. The Republican Party in Congress, I think, has not yet undergone the revolution that it needs. And in fact, with the loss of J.D. Vance going from the Senate to become vice president, Marco Rubio going to become Secretary of State, Josh Hawley is really like the most prominent remaining member of this pro-labor, anti or post-Reaganite right. So he's more outnumbered than ever in the Republican conference. And I think this gets to the deep structure of the Republican Party. I think of both parties as having three parties. I think of it as the six-party system. So each party has three parties. There's the donor party, There's the selectorate, it's the primary voters, and then there's the general electorate.
The actual humans, yeah.
And in practice, both parties tend to be dominated by the donors and the selectorate, by the primary voters, because who knows why people vote in the general election, right? And if they can just between general elections, and also most seats are so safe, Roy, as you know,
Right, yes.
that the primary election is the only danger to most members of the House and of the Senate. So they have to keep the sometimes crazy primary voters on their side, and they have to keep the donors on their side for the next primary election. And once they win the primary, they're almost guaranteed to win the general. So why do they need to reach out from those two groups? And the Republican Party is essentially an alliance of some maverick billionaires. Billionaires in recent years have trended towards the Democrats. Maybe they'll be going back. They're basically libertarian, whatever party they're in. So there's not that much philosophical difference between the Koch brothers and George Soros. They're both pro-gay rights, pro-free trade, pro-mass immigration. The real distinction has to do with their selectorates, with their primary voters. It's what you and your co-author, John Judas, call the shadow parties. And the primary voters are not representative of the party's general election voters in either party. They tend to be more affluent, more educated, and more ideological. And on the Republican side, it's, to use Marxist terms, it's the petty bourgeoisie. It's small business owners. It's even if they're big businesses, it's businesses where the CEO is either an owner or exercises kind of autocratic control over the enterprise. And the bourgeoisie, petty or grand, may be very charitable and philanthropic towards the poor personally, but hates unions, does not want to share power with organized labor, thinks that regulations are getting in the way. And this is a big obstacle that the new right faces in the Republican Party, because small business owners will be the most hostile to big government conservatism and to pro-labor gestures of any kind by the Republican Party.
Yeah. So it seems like the pro-labor new right is basically, the better parts of it, the smarter parts of it. They're trying to provide a, political, theoretical, economic framework for the actual electorate of the Republican Party and expanding it. And their problem is that the donor part of the Republican Party and the selectorate are basically incompatible with the vision of the new right and the way it thinks the Republican Party should try to reach and expand its actually existing electorate. So it's kind of like this is not a solvable problem. The equation does not have a solution. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm very pessimistic. And I'm even more pessimistic because the zone of intersection of the two circles in our Venn diagram, anti-wokeness, the primary voters who want to repeal the New Deal and just gut the federal government and extinguish unions, and the donors who want more H-1Bs, more guest workers in the fields, more offshoring, they can tell the politicians reasonably accurately, you don't need to go after the Teamsters, like Trump did or whatever. It's just, as long as the left is doing crazy things in 2026 and 2028, just go after DEI. Right? Go after affirmative action. Go after defund the police. And the thing is, I can't argue with that, right? Because a lot of the working class, they're not, if their kid has been in a K through 12 school where they had to pick a gender, right? They're going to vote for the Republicans.
Yeah, that's.
and then the Republicans can't say, well, we need to give them a reason by, having new forms of organized labor, which I'm in favor of. But politically, you don't need to have new forms of organized labor to get the working class vote, as long as they're upset that their kids are picking their genders.
Yeah, I guess the analog is on the Democratic side then too, in the sense that just as it kind of works for Republican politicians to define themselves in opposition to Democratic craziness and little else, so on the Democratic side, there's a pretty reasonable approach that just says, let's define ourselves by opposition to crazy Trumpism. And, that's kind of what our donor class wants. That's what our selectorate, profoundly believes in. And why do we need to figure out anything else? This is, at least in the short term, a winning formula. So, that's kind of, basically where we are? Both parties are obsessed with focusing on the crazy parts of the other party, and that's adequate in a way and fits, unfortunately, into the priorities of sort of the non-mass party part of those parties, which is the selectorate and the donors.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So the Republicans, as long as they can, will run against wokeness. It will be their culture war. And why wouldn't the Democrats run against Trump being Hitler, for 4 more years? And then his successor will be Hitler Jr. and so on and so on. That unites. Right. Because if you start talking about economics, the two circles of the Democratic Party are social democrats and neoliberals. And they don't agree on unions, on trade, even on immigration. Social democrats should be restrictionists, but they shut up about it. But there's some tensions now and then. One thing they can agree on is the woke social issues. But if they are told by their campaign strategists not to talk about them, not to rethink them, but to just shut up during the electoral seasons, well, they have to have something to talk about, and they can talk about how horrible the Republicans are, and they're separating families, with immigration. They're violating due process of accused criminal immigrants. They found a second one, by the way, who was deported in violation of a court order, and it turned out that this one had several crimes under his belt. But you wouldn't learn this, right? You would think this is Anne Frank or something.
Right, and all that. Yeah, they're pulling out all the stops. Okay, so let's think about the economics of the Democratic Party then, right? I mean, we have this fundamental contradiction that you just cogently outlined. But when they were in power, the argument of my Democratic friends would be, well, we did try to do a lot of this social democratic industrial policy kind of stuff, and we didn't get any credit for it. So, and it worked, but people don't realize it worked, or something like that. It's not entirely coherent. But what's your assessment of the economic policy of the Biden administration, which they would argue was a decisive break with neoliberalism and was, an investment in the future, and
Well, it was a break with neoliberalism in terms of trade. And Jake Sullivan gave an important speech at the Brookings Institution where he said we have to have a foreign policy, including a trade policy for the middle class. And as I've noted, the Biden administration actually ratcheted up tariffs and financial and technological export controls and so on China. And unlike the Trump administration, they combined it with a fairly rational set of industrial policies.
Okay, talk about those. What do you think was the good aspects of those?
Well, Biden really can't take credit from the CHIPS and Science Act because that had been in Congress for years, but it finally passed under him. But so that it's not the most elegant way to do it, but it massively subsidizes chip factories if they're located in the United States. And the result is, if the government throws money at something, then people will
Stuff
do
happens,
it. Yeah. And so we've had the factory construction. Trump argues, somewhat plausibly, that it would be cheaper to put up a tariff and then force them to sell those chips within the United States instead of giving them subsidies, right? So they can play China's subsidies off against America's subsidies. And this is what companies do with states, right? They have a bidding war among subsidies. That's true, but in areas like aerospace and chips, and automobiles, where you want exports to global markets, not just the U.S. market with a wall around it, then subsidies, there's a case for it. So subsidies and tariffs are just tools that you
Right.
can use.
I take it
Now,
you're less enthusiastic about the Inflation Reduction Act.
well, you mean the Green New Deal? Is that what you mean?
The soft Green New Deal, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the Green New Deal, which they couldn't get passed under its own name, and that was it was doubly flawed. The first flaw was it carried out fairly sophisticated industrial policies and import substitution for batteries, solar panels, windmills, and so on, which is fine, particularly with batteries. That's important. But it was premised on the idea that by 2030 or 2040, we're going to transition from natural gas and coal and oil to wholly renewable energy. So the centerpiece of their industrial policy was this idea of a transition. And then all of the left-wing NGOs came along and said, and it must be a just transition.
Yes.
And how do
I've
you
heard
make
that.
it a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy? By larding up the Inflation Reduction Act with subsidies for daycare and NGOs, and also having DEI. You have to have the right race and gender mix and in
Sure. Yeah. The
recipients
mind reels.
and hiring. And so it was a classic, what they call in Washington, a Christmas tree bill, right? You have the core of it, which was the renewable energy industrial policy, and then they hung all these ornaments on it. And it turned out many of the ornaments were just naked patronage subsidies to NGOs, right? Like this group associated with Stacey Abrams, the former
Yeah, right. Rewiring America or something like
They
that.
got $2 billion.
Yeah, pretty soon you're talking about real money, a billion here, a billion there.
Yeah. But looking forward, I think the Republicans, for all their flaws, are in better shape than the
Really? Okay.
Democrats. And the main reason is the deficit and the debt. And I've always been something of a deficit dove. But as now, we're paying more in interest on the debt than we are on defense. And at that point, even the deficit doves get a little bit nervous, okay? And it's always a benefit for the reactionary right seeking to cut back government spending and have austerity programs when the deficit is really alarming, right? When the economy is booming and the deficit is going down, then the deficit hawks like the late Pete Peterson don't get anywhere. But somewhere in heaven or the other place, Pete Peterson is smiling, right? So I think we're going to have a decade or two of deficit reduction, type politics, and that hurts the Democrats more than it hurts the Republicans, because even if you don't spend money on working class Republican swing voters, as long as they think the Democrats are crazy, they will simply vote for the Republicans.
Yeah. So it sounds like your view is to paraphrase George Bush's question, is our Democrats learning? Your reply to that would be no, they are not learning. They are basically on the same course that they previously were on.
And this is particularly a flaw with the social Democrats, with many of whom you and I are somewhat sympathetic. They have forgotten that in actual European social democracy, redistribution was not the major instrument of reform. It was wage compression.
Yes. Through
unions, which rested, though they will never admit it, on fairly low levels of immigration in the mid-20th century. And I've believed ever since the last wave of deficit hawkery 20 years ago that the center left, if it's going to have a future, is going to have to focus on what Jacob Hacker calls pre-distribution, which is really just distribution, right? That is, you raise wages and lower prices by rigging markets. you change the rules. You rig the markets so that the workers are paid more. You rig consumer markets so that utilities and necessities are cheaper. And you do it in such a way that Congress does not have to appropriate a penny. Okay? And that was the basis of the New Deal. The New Deal was not sending checks to people. Shortly after coming to being inaugurated the first time, President Roosevelt demanded that Congress abolish the dole. He has a famous speech. He says, we have to get rid of sending checks to unemployed people. This is a spiritual narcotic. He says it corrupts them. Instead, we have to have jobs programs, right? Like the CCC. You build up labor unions so that the profits are shared with the workers without having to go through Congress, right? And at the same time, you have the public utility regulations of the 1930s so that the prices of water, of gas, of electricity, these natural monopolies are lowered by utility commissions, but Congress is not paying money to help people afford their bills. And unfortunately, and maybe you can explain it to me, for some reason in the last 20 or 30 years, this has been completely forgotten by the American center left. They really think the Swedish model or the Danish model or whatever is sending checks to people. And that's not the model.
Yeah, no, it is a bit of a puzzle that it's all been forgotten, memory hold, and so on. Maybe to some extent the understanding was shaky to begin with, but it's certainly been completely obliterated. What about your idea, Mike, that given the parlous state of both parties that we sort of had a lightning tour of in this conversation, that the future may be more with sort of bipartisan or cross-partisan cooperation between populist factions of the respective parties, that to expect either one of these parties to get their act together as a party is not, you can't be too optimistic about it, but maybe there is a place or a way in which there could be cross-partisan cooperation between the populist factions of both parties. Do you still think that's a possibility?
Yeah. When you look at when the U.S. really worked between the New Deal and the 70s and 80s, the Civil Rights Revolution, and under FDR and his successors, including Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson, even Nixon, we had a de facto 4 or 5 party system. The parties in Congress were very weak. The party leaders were brokers among rival factions. They were not dictators. And all of these New Deal reforms, the interstate highway system under Eisenhower, the Civil Rights Revolution under Johnson, would not have passed without some Republicans teaming up with some Democrats.
Very true.
Right? So the Southern Democrats opposed civil rights, and the Northern Republicans teamed up with liberal Democrats in favor. And the typical House Speaker of the House and Senate Majority Leader was like Sam Rayburn or Lyndon Johnson. Johnson's motto as Senate Majority Leader was, "Come, let us reason together," from Isaiah. And he could be rough, but he was essentially brokering these very fragile coalitions that transformed America for the better. What happens with Newt Gingrich is he wants to completely demonize all Democrats as Democrats and succeeds in that, right? Like saying, well, we will contrast the liberal welfare state with the conservative opportunity society. So you semantically demonize the opposition. Then you get the Hastert rule under Dennis Hastert as Speaker of the House, Republican Speaker of the House. No bill can be voted on by all of the members of both parties simultaneously in the House unless a majority of Republicans favor it in conference.
Right.
So boom, that kills off any flexible.
Yeah, it's like an open season for tribalism. And of course, it works the other side too. Democrats now, obviously
under
demonize
Nancy
all
Pelosi,
Republicans.
Pelosi centralized power in the Speaker. And so a strong Speaker system and a strong Senate Majority Leader system is incompatible with the kind of fluid cross-partisan deal making. Now, we get some of it in emergencies. So, for example, we saw Josh Hawley team up with Bernie Sanders, on some of these votes on the stimulus. We saw J.D. Vance, when he was senator from Ohio, team up with his fellow Ohio senator on behalf of a union proposal to require 2 workers on railroads instead of 1 after an accident in Ohio. So it is, you do get some cross-party voting, but if you don't have that kind of fluidity, then you're going to get just permanent gridlock in Congress. And the other result of this gridlock is you don't pass laws anymore. Everything is done through reconciliation. It's all done through tax bills.
Yeah. No, I think Back to the Future would be not a bad idea for us in that respect. I wanted to conclude here, Mike, by talking about the kind of people we are and the kind of people of a glorious history in American life, to some extent, public intellectuals. You wrote a great article 3 years ago called The End of Progressive Intellectual Life. And I want to quote from this as follows. The centralized and authoritarian control of American progressivism by major foundations and the nonprofits that they fund and the large media institutions, universities, corporations, and banks that disseminate the progressive party line has made it impossible for there to be public intellectuals on the American center left. That's not to say progressives aren't intelligent and well-educated, but it's to say, and I love this line, being a progressive public intellectual is no longer an option in an era in which progressivism and anti-intellectual. So if you're an intelligent and thoughtful young American, you can't be a progressive public intellectual today any more than you can be a cavalry officer or a silent movie star. That's because in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, intellectual life on the center left is dead. So you said that 3 years ago, Mike. Any reason to revise that at the current time? And I just think it's very striking because to me, as someone who grew up on the center left and is sort of a public intellectual, I mean, to me, things seem so different now than they were even 15 years ago. And it's really, it's striking and it's appalling. And I think people still haven't absorbed the extent to which
in the article you quoted, I quoted a famous article I did in Dissent magazine in 1995 called The Death of Intellectual Conservatism. And so there was a parallel. I think intellectual conservatism became brain dead in the Clinton years, the Gingrich era, for the same reason. The donors controlled the magazines and think tanks and academic institutes, which are the natural habitats of intellectuals of whatever party or persuasion. The same thing happened to the progressives. It's ultimately about plutocracy. When you have billionaire donors, directly or indirectly, controlling all of these institutions where people who think for a living get paid, then you're going to, that's your boss. You're going to follow the party line.
Right.
Ultimately.
Now, the money.
Now, there's been at least temporary efflorescence of intellectual diversity on the right, really beginning with Trump's breakthrough in 2016.
Right. Yeah.
But that may be temporary. It's because there's this realignment going on. But it's quite possible that if there's a new pattern, then things will shut down as well. So I think at the end of the day, you have to choose. You can, I don't like the term public intellectual, but it's useful. You can defend a coherent public philosophy, whether it fits into one of the 2 party machines and their donors at any given moment or not, or you can be an apparatchik in this party nomenclatura and the money and the, economic security and so on. I mean, they're the apparatchiks, and that's true in Paris and London and Tokyo as well. But they don't have any fun. They're just apparatchiks. And they don't have any influence. At the end of the day, the mavericks of one generation enunciate what becomes the conventional wisdom, if they're lucky, in the next generation, whereas the apparatchiks are always behind the times, right? They're always, totally neutering themselves to promote the established line, but it's not going to be the established line in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, right. No, I agree with that. I mean, I like that line, apparatchiks, they just don't have any fun. And we intellectuals, we still want to have fun. And that's why we're trying to adopt
Well,
a more
if you want a
heterodox and open
secure
approach.
job and a steady retirement and a big 401k, then don't go into any kind of politics. Become an accountant.
Right. Yeah, that's for you youngsters out there. That's probably sound advice. Well, to return it, circle back to the one of the points you were making earlier. I mean, in a way, we should all wish for a more fluid politics if we're intellectuals, because that actually enables more people not to be apparatchiks, more people not to have a solidified party line behind one of the two polarized parties. If we had more fluid politics, it would probably be easier to intellectually float between different understandings and be more open-minded about what people who think differently than you have to say, or people in the other party. And we're not in that situation right now, but it seems like it would be much more desirable.
Well, it's certainly in terms of national flourishing and survival, it's important because no single party and no individual certainly can possibly understand everything that is going on and come up with the right solutions. And we don't even understand history correctly. So when we've had these great crises like the Civil War and Reconstruction and then the New Deal, we're taught that, well, Lincoln and the Republicans analyzed the crisis, and then they had the Transcontinental Railroad and this, that, and the other.
They wisely came up with the solutions.
Yeah, they just thought about it for 48 hours and came up with it. And Franklin Roosevelt came up with, saving deposit insurance for banks, the FDIC, and regulation of utilities. In reality, all of these programs had been devised by different people and factions over the previous 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. And they had been blocked in Congress politically. And then when the block was removed, when the Southern senators and members of the House resigned, who'd been blocking a lot of Whig proposals and Republican proposals, boom, you could do all of these things, some of which had nothing whatsoever to do with each other. Like the Homestead Act of the Lincoln years was Jeffersonian Midwestern farmers were behind that. And Ozarks and Appalachian farmers, they were part of the Republican coalition. That had nothing to do with the Transcontinental Railroad, but it all becomes possible. The same is true in the New Deal. All of these federal deposit insurance was a William Jennings Bryan agrarians.
Yeah.
Right? Roosevelt hated the very idea. He only reluctantly signed the bill, right? He thought it was a bad idea. So it doesn't even have to be coherent. So not only do you want lots of groups with their possibly crazy or possibly brilliant ideas, and they have to survive long enough that they're still present on the scene when the next crisis comes, so that their idea, which is needed in 2070, has not been forgotten because it was proposed in 2040, but nobody would pay for it. Nobody paid any attention. So you want to have lots of little sects and groups, but you also want to have pragmatic, experimental politicians who are not terribly bound, to the party line of their existing parties. And they have some freedom to have cross-cutting coalitions.
Yeah, well, I agree with all that, Mike. It's probably a great place to stop. We need pragmatic politicians and fluid, free-thinking intellectuals, and you put them together and you stir vigorously, and we might come up with something good. But it may take some time. So thank you, Mike, for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. Are you coming to Washington anytime soon? If so, I'll buy you lunch at AEI. On my traditional
I'll let you
offer.
know, and until then, keep being heterodox.
Yeah, for sure, brother.